With Academia, I'm Richard Price, CEO of Academia EDU, and as always, I'm here to help you make sense of the big questions academics are wrestling with around the world. And as a reminder, I'm going to present today's ideas as neutrally as possible. Think of this as an invitation to reflect, not as an endorsement of any particular viewpoint. So, today's episode dives into a really multifaceted and, let's call it, a layered topic. NATO's strategy in Afghanistan, as explored by Zahir Ahmad Khaleqi. Afghanistan is one of those places that's always in the headlines, but honestly, actually understanding what's happening there, why it matters, and what different countries are up to. And why should the rest of us even care about all these military maneuvers and diplomatic chess moves? Well, the core question, right, is how did NATO try to bring security and stability to Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks? And importantly, what happened when they brought new actors into the mix, like Turkey? The significance pretty much leaps out because, look, Afghanistan's position, historically, has always made it a crossroads between East and West, and what happens there, that ripples out to the wider world, affecting geopolitics, security, trade, and, people's everyday lives, even if they're nowhere near Kabul. So, quick pause, and I know I do this a lot, but I think if you've ever wondered why global alliances get into peacekeeping far from home, or why security missions so often turn into these decades-long projects, this paper really tackles that. And again, I'm not endorsing any view here, just laying out what the research says. Let's get into the nuts and bolts. Khaleqi walks us through NATO's entry into Afghanistan after the US ousted the Taliban government in 2001. In 2003, NATO officially took command of ISAF, that's the International Security Assistance Force, for the first time in its history outside of Europe or North America. The objectives: maintain public security, protect the central government, and fight terrorism and radicalism like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Lofty goals, right? So how did NATO go about this? Well, they didn't act alone. One of the most interesting points in the paper is Turkey's comparatively unique involvement. Turkey isn't geographically next to Afghanistan, but it's a NATO member. And crucially, it's seen by both Western and local actors as having a kind of bridge status, culturally Muslim, politically Western. The Turkish military wasn't just about security operations either. They actually played a major role in training Afghan security forces, doing local infrastructure projects, and facilitating dialogue between warring groups. There's an entire section about Turkish firms building roads and schools, and okay, I know this is tangential, but it got me thinking about how infrastructure is always being built and rebuilt. Kind of like Lego sets, maybe if we gave everyone more blocks, we'd have less conflict. Anyway, sorry, getting sidetracked there. Alright, back to the main story. NATO's strategy, according to the paper, was like a three-legged stool: military operations, civil reconstruction, and local capacity building. And ISAF was the practical tool for this. They set up provincial reconstruction teams, think little joint units of military and civilian workers, who built clinics, schools, and roads, trained Afghan police, helped with elections and all that. Turkey's presence, especially in regions like Kabul and Wardak, was apparently significant. But, and here's where the paper gets real, none of this happened in a vacuum. NATO faced massive challenges. There were disagreements among NATO partners about how much risk to accept. Guerrilla tactics and the geography, the mountains, made military operations tough. There were rising casualties, problems with local trust, and drug cultivation shot up during this period, opium in particular. And to be honest, the paper doesn't shy away from criticisms. Issues like poor coordination between domestic and NATO forces, lots of civilian casualties, and, yikes, even the unintended consequence of some groups gaining power in the chaos. So, what does all this mean for you sitting at home, maybe reading the news in, say, London or Istanbul or Singapore? Well, Khaleqi's research underlines that international interventions are never as simple as they look from the outside. We talk a lot about bringing stability or democracy somewhere, but real life, it's complicated. It's about adapting strategies, understanding local cultures, and, importantly, realizing that academic research, like this very paper, offers one lens to look through, not the final answer or an eternal truth. So as I wrap up, NATO's Afghanistan strategy, as described by Khaleqi, was ambitious, collaborative, and fraught with lessons for future peacekeeping, especially about local partnerships, infrastructure, and the rocky road of rebuilding from conflict. For all of us, maybe the takeaway is this: when you see headlines about international alliances or saving other countries, there's always more going on under the surface, and it's worth asking, who decides the strategy, who bears the cost, who defines success or failure? Thanks for tuning in. Remember, academic perspectives are a place to start your own thinking, not a substitute for it. I'm Richard Price, and this was In Depth with Academia. Catch you next time.